A heated debate about the correct theological position to hold has raged for centuries. This debate goes on to this day and is as heated as ever, with no signs of a consensus coming anytime soon. Christian theology is a very broad subject, so there is vast room for disagreement on a variety of issues, ranging from theology proper, Christology, soteriology, eschatology, etc. Calvinism is fundamentally a view about soteriology, but it is founded on various views about the nature of reality and the relation between God and the world. For example, it is generally believed that Calvinism, due to its strong doctrine of predestination, requires theological determinism to work, and many have rejected Calvinism because of its affirmation of theological determinism. In this video, I shall be defending the Calvinistic view. When I say Calvinistic view, what I mean is Calvinistic determinism, which should be understood as the thesis that God exists and that theological determinism is true. This leaves open the question of whether Calvinistic soteriology actually entails theological determinism. In defending Calvinism, I shall argue that the theological and philosophical costs of rejecting it are simply too great for Christians to pay. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. First things first, we have to define the term theological determinism. For the purposes of this video, I shall be defining theological determinism as the thesis that the set of all divine facts determines the set of all non-divine concrete facts. What does it mean for a fact to determine another fact? Well, the determination relation should be taken as a metaphysical in virtue of relation, which is a kind of metaphysical explanation. So if A determines B, then B is the case in virtue of A. Hence, we can say that theological determinism is the thesis that all non-divine concrete facts obtain in virtue of the set of all divine facts. This view would imply that all human choices and actions are determined by God. This is the Calvinist view. The alternatives to Calvinism, in one way or another, reject the theological determinism it proposes. In other words, the alternatives to Calvinism propose an indeterminist view of reality. There are three major alternatives to Calvinism in this debate. They are Molinism, open theism, and simple foreknowledge. One thing all these views have in common is their rejection of determinism and affirmation of indeterminism. Molinism affirms that God possesses middle knowledge, which is knowledge of the counterfactuals of libertarian freedom. It affirms that God actualizes possible worlds in which humans exercise libertarian freedom. Open theism proposes an open or indeterminate universe. On open theism, the future is as indeterminate for God as it is for man. On the simple foreknowledge view, because of the indeterminism involved in human free choices, God's knowledge of those choices does not come prior to creation. Now, there are various nuances involved in these views, but the bottom line is that they all affirm a libertarian view of human freedom and an indeterministic view of reality. This puts them at odds with the determinism of the Calvinist position. But what are the consequences of affirming indeterminism? Simply put, if indeterminism is true, then it follows that there are aspects of reality which are not under the absolute control of God. If indeterminism is true, then there are facts which obtain independently of facts about God. The Molinist, open theist, and simple foreknowledge proponents all agree on this point. For the Molinist, the realm of possibility from which God chooses to actualize a world exists independently of God. For the open theist, the future obtains independently of God. And for the simple foreknowledge proponents, the facts of the universe prior to creation are independent of God. Indeterminism proposes that there are some facts which are not necessitated by prior facts. Indeterminists must reject the idea that all non-divine concrete facts obtain in virtue of God. This has implications for a divine aseity. The doctrine of divine aseity teaches that God exists independently of everything else. It teaches that God is wholly self-sufficient and does not depend on anything external to himself to be who he is. But this doctrine is incompatible with an indeterministic view of reality. For indeterminism proposes that certain facts are independent of God. But if there are facts independent of God, if there are aspects of reality that he does not absolutely control, then he cannot be self-sufficient. This is because God would be limited in various ways by those indeterminate aspects of reality. For example, God's knowledge of aspects of reality outside his absolute control would have to be gained by consulting those aspects. God's knowledge would depend on and be conditioned by indeterminate factors which are external to himself. This implies that God is not wholly self-dependent. We can see this in the theological views that reject Calvinism. On the Molinist view, for example, God's knowledge of the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom is gained by looking outside himself and consulting a realm of possible worlds beyond his control. On open theism, God's knowledge of the future is dependent on whatever future the indeterministic forces actualize. And on the simple foreknowledge view, God's knowledge of human choices is wholly dependent on those choices. On these views, God has to look outside himself to know certain facts. This is incompatible with divine aseity. Indeterminism does not just condition God's knowledge, it also conditions God's power. If there are aspects of reality independent of God, then God is only as powerful as those aspects permit. And once again, God would have to be defined with respect to external factors, destroying his aseity. To reject Calvinism, then, is to reject the self-sufficiency of God and to affirm that God is limited by things outside himself. If indeterminism is true, then the scope of God's knowledge, power, and overall being would have to be qualified, and limitations would have to be imposed from without. It would mean that God is subject to laws that are beyond him. It would mean that God is just like man, finite and limited. Like man, he has to wait for the facts to occur before he knows them. Like man, he has to obey laws which are above him. Like man, he must look outside himself to learn about reality. This is not the God of the Bible. The Bible presents a God that is highly exalted above all creation. The Bible presents a God that can speak to man with absolute and unquestionable authority. What authority can God have over man if he is finite and limited, just like man is? We could always question what God says, since he, just like us, is subject to the whims of indeterministic forces. Whatever God says may end up being falsified by facts which are outside his control. If God is not in control of every single aspect of reality, then he cannot even rule out skeptical scenarios for any of his beliefs. There is no way God can know with certainty that his mind is not being influenced by a Cartesian demon. Since there are factors independent of him, there is no way to rule out such a possibility. What follows is that on indeterminism, God cannot know everything. What we have seen here is that indeterminism is the enemy of Christian theism. Indeterminism throws all the divine perfections out the window and reduces God to the status of a creature. If God is just like man, then there really is nothing that separates Christianity from unbelief. Perhaps God is slightly more powerful, slightly more knowledgeable, but in the final analysis, metaphysically speaking, God is no different from a superhero on such a view. The cost of rejecting Calvinism and affirming indeterminism is simply too much for the Bible-believing Christian to bear. To preserve divine aseity and the integrity of the Christian religion, we must affirm theological determinism.